The American sound. You might say it all began with a whir and a bang. The whirring started in 1794 with the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The bang came 87 years later from a location near the Winter Palace in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. And each of these sounds were followed by the echo of a million footsteps. The cotton gin allowed for the quick processing of cotton, and American exports of the fabric skyrocketed. And in the 10 years after it was invented, the population of African slaves in the United States more than doubled. The tragedy of slavery and its tremendous human cost came to be expressed in the field songs and spirituals that they sang.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
Over generations, these powerful spirituals were transformed into a new instrumental music called the blues. And the African and Caribbean rhythms that the early slaves danced to were also transformed, stylized by Stephen Foster and groups like the Jubilee Singers, and then turned into a whole new kind of music called ragtime. And the king of ragtime was one of our first great musical geniuses, Scott Joplin. This maple leaf rag was a sensation when it exploded on the musical scene in 1899. 18 years earlier, while young Scott Joplin was still practicing his scales back in Texarkana, an explosion of a very different sort took place 5,000 miles away, an explosion that rocked the world. On a cold March afternoon in 1881, Tsar Alexander II was riding around St. Petersburg when an anarchist threw a bomb under his carriage and blew him to smithereens. Alexander's son Nicholas was a rabid anti-Semite and used the assassination as a pretext to institute a series of savage pogroms against the Jewish population, burning their homes and driving them from the countryside. In the 15 years that followed, countless Russian Jewish men, women, and children would emigrate to the United States. As the cold and snow greeted the newly incorporated city of New York on January 1st, 1898, a quarter of its population, almost 1 million people in the 5 boroughs, were Russian Jews. What, you may ask, does this have to do with the American sound? 3 names: Moses Belin, Moshe Gershowitz, and Harris Kaplan. All 3 had fled the brutality of the Russian Empire and gazed upon the Statue of Liberty within 15 years of each other. Each heard the whir of the ship's engines and the bang as the gangplank hit the dock at Ellis Island. Each began their lives in America on Manhattan's Lower East Side, and each had a talented son. Moses Belin was a cantor. He, his wife Lena, and their 6 children, Sarah, Sirfi, Benjamin, Becky, Chassie, and the baby of the family, Israel, arrived in the United States on September 13th, 1893. By the time Sousa wrote this King Cotton March, they were firmly ensconced in a basement apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Moses couldn't find work as a cantor in New York, so he took a job at a kosher meat market and taught Hebrew on the side. He died when young Israel was 8. To support the family, the boy quit school after only 2 years of instruction to sell newspapers. He soon discovered that if he sang a song as he sold his papers, he would often get a tip. Izzy sang songs in cafes, saloons, and on street corners to pretty much anyone who'd want to stop and listen. And the melting pot of ragtime, Italian, and Irish songs, and Stephen Foster, he heard, became his musical education. Mantuno sole, ec belli omne, o sole mio disavere, o so Danny boy, the pipes are calling, from glen to glen, and way down upon the Swanee River. At 18, after acquiring an advanced degree in the School of Hard Knocks, Izzy went to work as a singing waiter at Chinatown's Pelham Cafe. After the restaurant closed, he stayed and taught himself to play the piano. Because of a knack for improvising dirty lyrics to popular songs, he was called upon to pen lyrics for a song competition with a rival restaurant. Izzy comes up with Marie from sunny Italy.
My sweet Marie from sunny Italy, oh how I do love you. Say that you'll always love me too. Forevermore I will be true.
Not so great, but remarkable for an unschooled immigrant kid in what amounted to a second language. And when the song was published, the lyricist on the title page was not Izzy Belin. And Izzy's new name was chosen with care, something with a Teutonic ring, with aspirations well beyond Chinatown. Irving Berlin. In 1911, now writing both words and music, he had his first big hit, a mix of ragtime, Sousa March, black minstrel show, with a trumpet call and a little Stephen Foster thrown in. Alexander's Ragtime Band became a sensation.
On and here, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band. Come on and hear, come on and hear. It's the best band in the land. They can play a bugle call like you never heard before. So natural that you want to go to war. That's just the bestest band of what am. Oh, honey lamb, come on along. Come on along, let me take you by the hand. Up to the man, the funny man, who's the leader of the band. And if you care to hear the Swanee River played in ragtime, come on and hear, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band.
This musical melting pot, with its cry of "Come on along," sparked an international song and dance craze. Berlin had taken the sounds of the streets, Manhattan's Lower East Side, and turned them into gold. He had a knack for adapting to new styles and trends, and his songs of the 1920s reflect not only a change in public taste, but in new technology as well. Edison's photograph of 1877 was more scratch and whir than tone, and required big-voiced singers like Enrico Caruso. Subtle it isn't. But when the electric microphone replaced a giant wooden horn in the recording studio, the big, noisy songs of the teens, like Alexander's Ragtime Band, gave way to something more lyric and intimate, and the bark of Caruso was replaced by the croon of Bing Crosby.
How much do I love you? I'll tell you no lie. How deep is the ocean? How high is the sky?
On Christmas Day, 1926, Berlin presents its first baby, Mary Ellen, with a new song. Blue Skies reflects much more than a father's love for his newborn daughter. Listen to this melody. It reflects Irving's childhood too. Voreovet Elohim Esrom Habeshi Warada Deshoso Kivo Shulvos Mikolamek Ahu Koroeim La'asos. Then God blessed the seventh day and called it holy, for with this day he completed the work of creation. A nod to Berlin's cantor father as he celebrated the birth of his first child. As a Bowery boy, Izzy would sing tunes by Yiddish operetta composer Abraham Goldfaden. And it seems Maestro Goldfaden wants to help in the celebration as well, with a lullaby. Wiegt sie Käse, der singt ihm. And a little children's ditty. Berlin seamlessly weaves together past and present. And the word blue, first it means sad, then skies, then the bluebird of happiness. And the harmonies, when we're in the verse, we're blue sad, but the music is in sunny major. And the blue skies of the chorus sing out in minor with lots of wistful harmonies. Becoming a father is a complex, conflicted experience, and yet in many ways this song is so simple. The famous chorus has just 61 words, and all but 13 of them are just one syllable. Its melody is built on a 5-note scale used in hundreds and hundreds of folk songs. And an American folk song it has become, recorded and re-recorded by Bing Crosby, Benny Goodman, Diana Krall, Ella Fitzgerald, Eve Cassidy, Willie Nelson, Bob Tavani, and Thelonious Monk, and dozens of others.
I was blue, just as blue as I could be. Every day was a cloudy day for me. Then good luck came a-knocking at my door. Skies were gray, but they're not gray anymore. Blue skies, smiling at me. Nothing but blue skies.
all things going so right. No sympathy hurrying by. When you're in love, my how they fly. Blue days, all of them gone. Nothing but blue skies from now on.
It's amazing that, with all the poetry and musical sophistication of his songs, that Irving Berlin never learned to read music. And he could only play the piano using the black keys. Here's the world's most famous black key melody, known to every adolescent who saunters by a keyboard. He had a piano specially built with a lever that would transpose his black note piano playing into any key. And to expedite the composition process, he hired a musical assistant to take dictation. Berlin would plunk out the melodies. And then listen as the musical assistant tried to fill in the harmonies. No, that chord's not right. No. No, it's a chord that sounds like it can hardly speak. That's the one. You're in heaven and you can hardly speak. Now play the whole phrase.
And I seem to find the happiness I see when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek.
Cheek to Cheek came out in 1935 in the movie Top Hat. So we're getting a little ahead of our story, which brings us back to 1918. Berlin was also looking for someone to write down a song knocking around his head called That Revolutionary Rag, and he stopped by Remix Music. He was then directed to an eager young tune plugger, the 19-year-old George Gershwin, who made short work of the job and promptly asked Berlin for a job as his musical assistant. "Hey kid, do you write any music of your own?" "Yes, sir." "Well, let me hear something." "Whoa, forget it, kid. You're too good. You need to work on your own." Irving Berlin was young Gershwin's idol. Like him, George's father had also emigrated from Tsarist Russia. Moishe Gershowitz landed at Ellis Island on August 14, 1890. He met and married another Russian immigrant, Rosa Berushka. Sometime before the turn of the century, he took the first name Morris and changed the family name to Gershwin. They had 4 children, Ira, George, Arthur, and Francis. George first displayed an interest in music when he was 10. His parents bought a piano for his older brother, Ira, but to his parents' surprise and Ira's relief, it was George who wanted to play. Owning a piano was a point of pride. The whir of the pulleys and the bang of the piano hitting the fire escape trumpeted success in the New World. And the Gershwins were not the only family in their building to own a piano. There were the Friedmans upstairs. And the Adelsons above them. And the Faders in the top apartment. Okay, that's enough of that. Throw in a gramophone or two, and you have what was in Gershwin's ears throughout his childhood. This was the beginning of an exuberant love affair with music that would last him the rest of his life. Young George would roller skate up to Harlem to listen to jazz outside the Baron Wilkins Club. He would sit on the sidewalk and eavesdrop on the exciting rhythms and raucous tunes of Colonel James Reese Europe's Clef Club Orchestra. He was fascinated with rags and blues, and soon he was taking this music to his piano lessons. His teacher, Charles Hambitzer, barraged with George's arguments that popular music could be an important art if a composer could bring the same skill to it as to a symphony, writes in a letter. The boy's a genius without a doubt. He wants to go in for this modern stuff, jazz and whatnot. But I'm not going to let him for a while. I'll see that he gets a firm foundation in the classics first. George was plugging songs and making piano rolls at Remix Music, but he became disillusioned. The music he was selling was catchy but incredibly trite and could be vamped over the same 4 boring chords. Who's to say that folks buying sheet music to chime in around the piano wanted anything better? One place George's nimble improvisations were not going, and that was to a family sing-along. Then Irving Berlin's Alexander's Ragtime Band burst onto the scene. Berlin's timing was perfect. And this and numbers like I Love a Piano showed George how much room there was for great inventive songwriting. And you can hear Irving Berlin's influence, the minstrel sound and nod to Stephen Foster of Alexander's Ragtime Band, 6 years later in Gershwin's first big hit.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks in CIX. I even know my mammy's waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee. The folks up north won't see me no more when I get to that Swanee.
Thanks in part to Al Jolson's energetic performance, Swanee sold 2.5 million copies of sheet music, and George Gershwin became an international celebrity. Now collaborating with his brother Ira, a string of hit Broadway shows followed. On January 3, 1924, Ira spotted an announcement in the New York Herald Tribune. A concert entitled An Experiment in Modern Music, presented by Paul Whiteman and his Palais Royal Orchestra, will feature a new jazz concerto by George Gershwin. George had initially turned down the commission, but in light of this ambush newspaper announcement and Paul Whiteman's spirited sales pitch on the phone the following morning, Gershwin decided to give it a try. With only 5 weeks left until the performance, Gershwin hastily set about composing a piece. And on a journey to Boston for the opening of his show, Sweet Little Devil, the ideas for Rhapsody in Blue came to his mind. This is how he described it later. It was on the train, with its steely rhythms, that I suddenly heard, and even saw on paper, the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot and our terrific national pep. And here's what he heard that night. First, the whir of the engine. And then the bang of the rails and the moan of the whistle. Then an unused trunk song popped into his head. It would make a great opening for the Rhapsody. Weeks later, when the Rhapsody was in rehearsals, Chester Hazlitt, Whiteman's wisecracking clarinetist, was joking around and played it klezmer style. Gershwin jumped out of his seat. "That's perfect! That's perfect! Do it that way in the show." Back on that Boston-bound train, the next tune that came to George was a stride piano theme like the ones he heard up in Harlem as a boy. He could play in a razzle-dazzle style he learned as a song plugger back at Remix Music. And even imitate the piano comics, his buddies Chico Marx and Jimmy Durante. His brother Ira made two important contributions to the Rhapsody. First, he persuaded George to add a slowed-down lyric version of one of his trunk songs to the middle of the piece. "It'll make a nice contrast with the jazz." George had been calling the piece American Rhapsody, but then Ira attended an exhibition of James McNeill Whistler, who titled his paintings Nocturne in Black and Gold and Arrangement in Gray and Black, better known as Whistler's Mother. Afterward, he came back to George's apartment with his second contribution. "This piece has so many blue notes. Why don't you call it Rhapsody in Blue?" There was a mad dash to the finish line, and in the performance, Gershwin improvised most of the solo piano part. At one point near the end, Paul Whiteman stared down at a page of the score completely blank, except for the scrawled direction, "When George nods, go." George Gershwin had once said, "My place is America, and my time is now. This music shouts, "Made in America." And as they say in showbiz, the rest is history. Success came early to Gershwin, and he took it with disarming grace. He and Ira were in Hollywood working on a film when George fell ill. The diagnosis was a brain tumor. He died on July 11th, 1937. That he died so young and with so much left to do is one of American music's greatest tragedies. But his brother Ira soldiered on in Hollywood and back on Broadway. In 1943, he was called in to write lyrics for an MGM movie called The North Star. The score of the film was to be written by a prominent composer named Aaron Copland. Aaron and Ira's brother George had so much in common. Like George's papa, Aaron's father, Harris Kaplan, had emigrated from Tsarist Russia. After moving to Manhattan's Lower East Side, he changed his name to Copland. He married Sarah Mittenthal, also of Russian Jewish extraction, and just arrived from Waxahachie, Texas, and the couple settled on Washington Avenue in Brooklyn. Aaron and George were nearly the same age and grew up within a mile of each other. Both played the piano and even studied with the same composition teacher, a Dvorak protege named Reuben Goldmark. Yet, while George was first drawn to Tin Pan Alley, Aaron Copland was a serious classical composer from the start. Did I say serious? I meant avant-garde. This headline may have been a bit of an overreaction. Copland spent his early 20s in Paris, studying with the famous composition teacher Nadia Boulanger, and became part of the modernist movement. What you just heard is a bit of his first symphony that was premiered at Carnegie Hall in January of 1925. The same month that Fred and Adele Astaire were hoofing it up to Gershwin's fascinating rhythm, and Irving Berlin penned this beautiful song, Always, for his new bride, Ellen McKay. Like George Gershwin, Copland also wrote jazz. At least he thought it was jazzy. His music for the theater and his jazzy piano concerto of 1927 were widely panned by the critics as stiff, intellectual music dressed up as jazz. Copland, stung by this reception, retreated into the world of serious composition, writing works like this, his piano variations. Now Copland was firmly ensconced at the League of Composers and the MacDowell Colony for Creative Artists, attending contemporary music concerts, writing books, and giving lectures. Then something happened. In 1932, Copland visited Mexico City at the invitation of the composer Carlos Chavez. Chavez wanted to introduce him to the music of the Mexican people. He took Copland downtown to El Celam, Mexico, which, according to the guidebook, was a Harlem-type nightclub of the people, with a grand mariachi band and 3 halls, one for people dressed in city clothes, one for those in overalls but also wearing shoes, and one for barefoot. Copland noticed the sign on the wall, "Please don't throw lighted cigarette butts on the floor so the ladies won't burn their feet." Later, he wrote about the experience. In some inexplicable way, while milling about in those crowded halls, one really felt a live contact with the Mexican people. The electric sense one sometimes gets in far-off places of suddenly knowing the essence of a people, their humanity, their separate shyness, their dignity and unique charm. Copland was inspired to write a work conveying his impression of the Mexican people. Using Mexican folk tunes, he created a vivid, joyful portrait of life south of the border, calling it, you guessed it, El Celam, Mexico. The work was a hit. Back in New York City, Copland became more interested in writing music for everyday use, for school bands and musical productions, for plays and radio dramas. And the whir of the film projector drew him to Hollywood, where he created movie scores for Of Mice and Men and Our Town. He also became much more involved in writing music for dance. With the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, ballet companies became more interested in scores with a real nationalist American feel. And Copland was glad to oblige. And drawing on his mother's experiences as a girl in Texas and the cowboy song she would sing, he wrote his first major ballet, Billy the Kid. And this is when he made an important discovery. This music from Billy the Kid, with its stately tempo and open-sounding harmonies, had a deep effect on the audience. It created a sense of vast spaces, the American West. It was the birth of the American sound. Copland had found his voice, vaulting melodies and harmonies as open as the western prairie. Later that same year, he wrote a work for orchestra and narrator featuring quotes from the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. And in this Lincoln portrait, Copland, like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin before him, quotes Stephen Foster. Unlike them, he takes a pass on quoting old folks at home in favor of the Camptown races. Soon after, he turned his attention to writing a ballet for dancer and choreographer Martha Graham. She wanted an American subject and sent him a scenario. "This is the legend of American living. It is like the bone structure, the inner frame that holds together a people." Copland understood the essence of the story, the pioneer American spirit, its youth, optimism, and hope. He sat at the piano trying out some ideas, and the opening theme came to him. It sounded like a spring morning, a blue horizon, And it was so simple, only 6 notes. When the notes of this theme are stacked like double spinal columns, they create the 2 most basic chords. On which all tonal harmony, every song of Stephen Foster, all the ragtime of Scott Joplin, the ballads of Irving Berlin, and snappy Gershwin musicals are based. And it had such a feeling of beginning, of reaching up. This 6-note musical theme flows through the entire ballet, which evolved into a story of a spring celebration, of the American pioneers of the 1800s building a new Pennsylvania farmhouse. The characters in the ballet are a newlywed couple, their neighbors, and a revivalist preacher and his flock. In the ballet's introduction, all the characters slowly process in and take their places around the stage. And then the action of the ballet begins. There is a duo for the bride and her intended. And a scene with the preacher and his flock. Copland discovered a hymn in an 1848 anthology of Shaker music and composed a set of variations on it to describe scenes of daily activity for the bride and her farmer husband. It's called The Gift to Be Simple.
Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight.
The bride takes her place among her neighbors. At the end, the couple is, as Martha Graham described it, quiet and strong in their new house. And so it was with Aaron Copland. He had learned what a gift simplicity could be. The 3 men who began this story, Moses Belin, Moshe Gershowitz, and Harris Kaplan, emigrated to America from Russia in search of opportunity for a better life. They provided their 3 talented sons with a fresh perspective in a new world where the only limitation is your own imagination. It's the promise of America, a new beginning, endless possibilities. It's Irving, the homeless kid from the Lower East Side who, armed with energy, ambition, and a good, strong singing voice, reinvented himself. It's George, the Tin Pan Alley whiz kid who took his music uptown, melding jazz with classical music and inventing a sound full of sophistication with an urban snap. And it's Aaron, the internationally trained intellectual who reinvented himself by going the other way, back downtown, by way of Mexico and the Wild West. It's radio, records, and movies which allowed their music to seep into our national consciousness. And their simple, direct, joyful sounds have become part of our national DNA. The whir and bang that launched the American sound has become a hymn to its past, its present, and especially its future. Irving, George, and Aaron, and all of us here today, are products of America's sonic and spiritual melting pot. Their stories are our stories. We, like that hopeful couple at the end of Appalachian Spring, can open the door on each new day with fresh, wide-eyed wonder.